China strikes back against the US. No trade deal till 2020? And the Chinese Communist Party's new nemesis is Batman? That and more on this week's China Uncensored. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News Headlines has been sponsored by Surfshark. Because if you're interested in the kind of subversive news we cover, you'll want to protect your identity online. The United States is really angering Beijing with its new approach to China, actually standing up for American principles. I know, I never thought our politicians could do it either.
The U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly approved a bill aimed at China's crackdown on its Muslim minority. The Uyghur Act of 2019 calls for the closure of mass detention camps in the province of Xinjiang. It would see sanctions imposed on a member of China's Politburo for the first time.
Sanctioning a member of the Politburo is huge, unprecedented.
We are sending a message to Beijing. America is watching, and we will not stand silent.
The Uyghurs are an ethnic group that lives here in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. For more on how autonomous the Chinese Communist Party lets the Uyghurs be, here's Republican Congressman Chris Smith.
Children ripped from the warm embrace of their families to be indoctrinated in communist ideology and forced to renounce their religious culture and language. Rape, sexual abuse, and forced abortions of women being held in internment camps. Forced labor on a scale that allows Chinese companies to profit from modern-day slavery.
You know, that's almost heartwarming. Not the rape in modern-day slavery, that's terrible. I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans working together. Chinese Communist Party, it brings America together. The U.S. Senate has passed a similar bill, but now they have to vote again on the House version before it goes to President Trump to sign. This Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act comes shortly after Congress pretty much unanimously passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and the Protect Hong Kong Act. And President Trump signed those into law last week, in spite of Beijing's objections, after the media freaked out that he might not sign the bills, and then freaked out when he did sign the bills. But even if the media coverage is a bit haywire, the important thing is that the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House all agree on standing up for freedom and democracy and calling out China's human rights issues. As you can imagine, the Chinese Communist Party is not happy about all this unity and talk of freedom and democracy. They've worked so hard for years to keep other countries from criticizing them. Why isn't it working anymore? And so, the empire strikes back. The Chinese empire strikes back.
Beijing on Wednesday furiously condemned a piece of American legislation calling for a tougher U.S. response to China's treatment of Muslim minorities. A foreign ministry spokeswoman warned the bill could impact negotiations aimed at ending a grueling trade war between Washington and Beijing.
Do you believe that if the U.S. takes measures to hurt China's interests, we will just sit back and let it happen? I think for every erroneous action, an appropriate price must be paid. An appropriate price must be paid.
Oh my gosh, what are they going to do?
Several sources familiar with Beijing's stance told Reuters that the bill could jeopardize the so-called Phase 1 deal already fraught with disagreements and complications.
Oh no, it could jeopardize the trade deal. How could things possibly get worse? Oh geez, they suspended U.S. port calls? What a nightmare. Anything else? What? They're sanctioning American nonprofit groups? No. I'm sorry, folks, but the U.S. can't stand up for human rights and democracy anymore. The price is just too high. But the trade war, you say? Well, let's see what's going on there. It hasn't been great for China's economy. Capital investment by Chinese firms saw its lowest growth in 3 years. According to a Reuters analysis, that's because a weakening economy, tight credit, and prolonged trade war with the United States dent sales growth and cash reserves. So the longer the trade war goes on, the more it hurts the Chinese economy. And now, Trump says he may have to keep it going till after the US presidential election next year. Meanwhile, more mid-sized American companies are moving out of China. Now that doesn't mean they're coming back to America. Some are considering that, but a lot of other ones are just diversifying their supply chains to other Asian countries. So you might be seeing fewer made-in-China products and more made in Vietnam. Good old freedom-loving communist Vietnam. But there's one business that's apparently booming in China. This is Yiwu City in Zhejiang province. I talked about the city before on a Christmas episode. The Chinese city that makes your Christmas. They manufacture everything. Loads of Christmas items, sure, but also a lot of the flags of the world. Not just country flags, but political slogan flags. And they're predicting Trump will be re-elected. See, in 2016, 5 months before the last presidential election, the people of Yiwu noticed more people were ordering Trump flags than Clinton flags. And so they predicted that Trump would win. Yes, a tiny Chinese manufacturing city was more accurate at predicting election results than the New York Times. Of course, the 2020 election is still a ways out. Maybe 5 months before the election, the good people of Yiwu might notice people ordering a very different flag. But while relations between China and the US may be strained, relations between China and Russia are doing great. They just opened a natural gas pipeline linking Siberia to northeastern China. It's the biggest energy project for Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. How nice for them. This is part of what the Chinese Communist Party is calling the Polar Silk Road. China wants a slice of the shipping lanes and natural resources of the Arctic. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates the Arctic holds about 13% of the world's undiscovered oil reserves and 30% of the natural gas reserves. The northernmost part of China is still almost 1,000 miles from the Arctic Circle. But don't worry, China is still labeling itself a near-Arctic state. And that means our new Cold War can happen in a place that's actually pretty cold. Speaking of frosty relationships, the Chinese telecom giant Huawei is in trouble. And for once, not with the US, but actually inside China. Apparently, there's been a huge social media backlash inside China against the company, which is bad because the Chinese government has been trying to make Huawei a rallying point for patriotism. Except, new details came to light in the case of a former employee who was arrested and jailed for 251 days following an unproven accusation of blackmail from the company. Yeah, that's not a good look. According to the New York Times, many Chinese proudly abandoned their iPhones for Huawei phones. But the backlash to the jailing of a longtime employee after a labor dispute has made it clear that people in China are starting to sour on the company. And Huawei is getting on the wrong side of the US, too. According to the US Commerce Secretary, Huawei is trying to convince its suppliers to break the law by moving offshore. Huawei is on a US trade blacklist over national security concerns, but it's hard to enforce that on overseas suppliers. So, Huawei is trying to convince American suppliers to get around US national security concerns by going overseas. So, I'm in the market for a new phone, but there's no way I'll do Huawei. I would just like to remind everyone that the China-Pakistan friendship is unbreakable. Also, more than 600 Pakistani girls were sex trafficked to Chinese men. But don't worry, that's going to stop. Not the sex trafficking, that will continue. The investigation into the sex trafficking, that will stop. According to AP, officials with knowledge of the investigation say that is because of pressure from government officials fearful of hurting Pakistan's lucrative ties to Beijing. So you see, when the US State Department labeled China as one of the worst human trafficking offenders, they got it all wrong. China is the best human trafficking offender. Speaking of unbridled disasters, remember that Chinese scientist who genetically engineered actual human twin babies? He edited a gene to make the twins immune to HIV. Too bad he couldn't make himself immune to public backlash and house arrest. Speaking of not actually being immune, the twins. Turns out the twin girls are probably not immune to HIV. That was a lie. But they may have unintended mutations. And finally, Batman has run afoul of Chinese censors. Frank Miller's new graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns, The Golden Child, uses this image of a young Batman throwing a Molotov cocktail. But my favorite state-run media, the Global Times, helped set off a firestorm of criticism in China by saying it was a reference to Hong Kong protests, or riots as they call it. After the backlash, DC Comics showed that it knows a thing or two about heroes, and how not to act like one. They quickly removed the image, which led, I'm happy to say, to more backlash against DC. And that does it for this week's China News Headlines. What do you think? Leave your comments below. And this episode has been sponsored by Surfshark. When you go online, everything you do is being tracked and logged by the websites you visit and your internet service provider, and in many cases by the government. Especially if you're in a place like Xinjiang or Hong Kong, this kind of tracking can put you at risk of surveillance and even arrest. That's why you should use a VPN like Surfshark to protect your identity. When you use Surfshark's clean web mode, you'll be protected from ads, trackers, and malware, and phishing attempts by Chinese hackers. Plus, with Surfshark, you can connect as many devices as you want. Try it out with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, Surfshark has a special discount for China Uncensored fans. Go to surfshark.com/uncensored and use the code UNCENSORED to get 83% off a 2-year plan and 3 additional months free. Protect yourself online. Click the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.